Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast with Hal. Hal, for everyone out there listening, please introduce. You like how I do that? That's yeah.
So good.
Please introduce yourself, Hal.
Hey, I'm very happy to be here. I'm inside and it's a beautiful day outside, but that's okay. I'm Hal Drakesmith. I'm a professor of iron biology at the University of Oxford in the UK. And I've got a lab here and we do all sorts of experiments and try and find out stuff about iron biology, iron deficiency, anemia, and infection and the immune response.
What do you find to be the most important about iron biology, at least from your perspective? And then I guess probably from maybe a global standpoint would be the most important.
Yeah, sure. So I think probably when everybody thinks about iron deficiency, they might also think about anemia. And that's because iron is really important in making red blood cells. And in red blood cells, what the iron does is it binds oxygen and it transports the oxygen around your body where it's needed. And so, this is why we really need red blood cells. And that's, classic and very well described. And if people don't get enough iron, then it's sure they do become anemic. But what we've been finding is that other processes in us also really need iron too. And we're trying to dig down as to what else in the body and what other systems that we have really need iron, and so which suffer when people can have iron deficiency. And probably the thing that's come out most recently and most strikingly is your immune response. So the way that you make antibodies and the way that your white blood cells, things like T cells and B cells and other cells with a cool name like natural killer cells, they all really need iron to work too. And they need iron a lot more than we thought that they did. So that if people don't have enough iron that can get to their white blood cells, the immune system can suffer. And we've been working a heck of a lot on that.
What do you find? I guess the focus would be the general's public. Like, what's their consumption when it comes to iron? Is it enough? Is it their daily diet? I know there's probably people that they're skipping meals. I know that's like a big thing with diet trends, but there's got to be some ramifications with it as well too. If you skip meals, you're not getting the essential nutrients. Where I start looking at like, is the overall population healthy, and what can we be doing to help out? And that usually leads down the rabbit hole of like supplementation. And as much as I like that, I just don't necessarily trust it a whole lot too. I'm like, we should be getting it from our foods, but also, I mean, how many people are able to really check and make sure they're getting all their daily values of everything? So then it relies on, actual little supplement pills that maybe we could help out with people. But then there's a balance like we were talking about, which is the aspect of getting too much. How do you get something where you'll help out your immune system, like an immune booster, I would say, but enough to where you're getting your daily value so you're not deficient of iron, but also not getting so much to where you can get sick from it?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack with that. So I think let's start with the idea of which types of populations get iron deficiency and why they get them. Let's start with that. And then let's think about how the best way is to counter that safely. And these are two really big questions. They're very complex questions, but I'll try and sort of dig down to them in a relatively simple way. So about a quarter of the world is believed to be anemic. And about half of those people who are anemic, the major cause is not getting enough iron. And so they're iron deficient to the extent that it's affecting how many red blood cells that person can make. But there's a whole load of other people who are iron deficient, who are not iron deficient enough to become anemic, but their iron deficiency still exists and is still having some effect on their health. And it might be causing fatigue, might be causing growth development issues, potentially cognitive issues as well. In particular, I'm talking about really now is in infants. So the demographics of which populations are most affected by iron deficiency is quite interesting. So it's certainly newborns and infants, because they're growing really fast and they need lots of iron to help their growth. and particularly probably for the brain, but also bone development and so on. In fact, in infants, less for red blood cells and more for other stuff, it's thought, because the infant has still got a load of red blood cells from its mum. Then children and adolescents, again, rapid growth, need lots of energy, particularly if boys putting on muscle. Muscle's made of a protein called myoglobin. Myoglobin needs iron too. Then premenopausal women can lose iron, obviously, sort of every month, and that needs to be replaced. And if it isn't replaced, then iron deficiency and anemia is very common in premenopausal women. And then during pregnancy, then more iron, even more iron is needed for the mum to increase her blood volume and to support the growth of the growing baby inside. And then finally, the elderly are particularly prone to iron deficiency. And that's probably for slightly different reasons, not so much nutrition, but just kind of general difficulty in absorbing iron, and maybe the gastrointestinal tract, the gut might not be working quite so efficiently in absorbing nutrients. So lots of different populations. And also what I would say is that that's not the same in every country in the world. So we do a lot of work with collaborators in sub-Saharan Africa. And in those situations, then it really is a lot of nutrition. That's an issue in getting the right amount of nutrients at the right time. And it's infants in particular and premenopausal and pregnant women who really do have that burden of iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia. It's really, it's a serious burden. It's one of the most common reasons for illness in the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. It's a really serious issue in terms of health and morbidity. It doesn't kill people, but it makes the population as a whole less healthy. So it's important in that respect.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, that's why there was like an invention of the Haitian mud cookies as well too, which was eating dirt and they put like butter on it or something. But it's you're just eating dirt. But it's a weird thing when women who are pregnant go through an iron deficiency, they have a craving for dirt, and that
Yeah, that's right.
sounds insane. But it's because there's metals and there's things that their body is like somehow instinctually telling them like this is a craving because you need these types of minerals. And usually it's with pregnant women because the baby is causing them to need more of that certain supplement.
But it can also be young children too, and I think one of the names for it is pica, Pica, and yeah, it's quite a peculiar phenomenon. I'm not sure it's entirely always related to iron, but you're right, it is related to it's a peculiar, probably extraordinarily ancient, not necessarily just human type of response to try and get more nutrients at a certain time of life. So what should we be doing? What are the best ways of getting the amount of iron into us? And you're right that clearly food is the right way, but different foodstuffs have very different amounts of iron, and depending on things like religious beliefs or personal beliefs, you might not want to have a lot of red meat, which contains a lot of iron in a very absorbable form. If you drink a great deal, an enormous amount of tea, that's thought that potentially inhibit the ability of the body to absorb iron, although that data is a little bit controversial. There are some foods which naturally contain substances which also inhibit the ability of the body to take up iron. So you've got to be kind of quite careful about what food you might want to eat, which has got enough iron in it in a form that can get into the body.
Wait, you said controversial though. Why is it controversial? Is it because everyone's nutrient needs are differently? Like I haven't eaten red meat in a very, very long time just because my body can't handle it. It doesn't process it properly, but I'll eat fish all day. It's actually where I got mercury poisoning from cans of tuna, but it's good, so I buy it. But I think like when we talk about like nutrient standards for things, my kind of little worry is the fact of like we as people, like I mentioned before with diet trends, as people, feel like we're on a time pace and we have to hurry up as much as possible. So a lot of times it's skipping meals. And I think even though we talked about before, you talked about before with diminished capacity of having maybe some low iron levels, over a long span of time, you start suffering from severe side effects. Like it might not be something like right now you're going to like just have insane brain fog or you're going to have all these types of things wrong with you. But over a period of time, you're slowly starting to realize that you're getting tired more. You're taking more naps because you feel like you need more naps. And necessarily, you just might not be getting the proper nutrients.
Yep, I think that's probably fair enough. But you're absolutely right. And again, thinking about what is the right type of food, and fish is pretty good, and fish has got a lot of extra stuff in it. so if I can give a little bit more detail, there are kind of two forms of iron that we can take in our diet. One is iron in heme. And so heme is a little molecule which iron binds to, is within, and it's a little ring essentially of carbon and other atoms, and iron sits right in the middle of it, and that is the heme that is in a protein called hemoglobin, which is in red blood cells, and it is why blood is red. It is the iron that's in it that's binding oxygen. But heme is most commonly found in red meat. It's why red meat is also red. It's the heme there is in myoglobin, as the protein I mentioned before, in muscle, and that's really easily absorbed. Heme is really easily absorbed by humans. It's very efficient, but most iron that we have in our diet is actually not in that form. Frequently, it's in an inorganic form, which is quite hard for the body to absorb, and frequently doesn't really get in very efficiently at all. And in iron supplement tablets, for example, iron is not in that heme form, usually, or almost never. We're trying to get more heme type of iron supplements going, but it's quite difficult. So in this inorganic form, it's very poorly efficiently absorbed, which means if you take an iron tablet, often not much of the iron that's in the tablet gets into your bloodstream where it's needed. It stays in your gut. And there it can cause trouble. And this is an issue for taking too much iron tablets. So the types of trouble it can cause are when it's in the gut and it's not being absorbed by the body, instead other things want to eat it. And those are bacteria that are in your gut that otherwise wouldn't cause you any harm. But if they get extra iron, they might divide and grow and be really happy because they need iron to grow too. Almost every single form of life on Earth needs iron to grow. There are very few exceptions. So if you have some bugs in your gut that are unfriendly bacteria and are being kept in check normally by your friendly bacteria, you add iron into that mix, then you can get an outgrowth of the bad bacteria, and then you can get inflammation and all sorts of side effects like that. The other issue is that it's just, it's not that nice having a lot of iron in your gut, and it turns your poo black, and it's just, I got a friend of mine who said, what did he say? He said it was like pulling a Christmas tree out, and it's just not the best, really. But so there are side effects. So one of the things that we're really working on as a field is to figure out, as a field of research, lots of people all over the world addressing this, what is the correct amount of iron in a tablet to take per day and when, so that you absorb it most efficiently and you get fewer side effects. And you'd kind of think that this had been worked out, right? Because giving iron to people with iron deficiency has been around for many, many, many decades, but it's still not worked out well. And I think one of the major reasons for that has been that we haven't understood the underlying biology of how human beings deal with that iron. And at this point, I'm going to kind of plug the key molecule that my lab and other labs have worked on. So you'll have heard of insulin, right? So insulin regulates glucose, but it turns out we have a hormone that regulates iron, but it's much more relatively recently discovered. And so this molecule in this country, in the UK, we call hepcidin, and you would call it hepcidin. So yeah, there you go. I'll try and call it hepcidin, but if I might fail. So hepcidin is to iron what insulin is to glucose. It basically is the hormone that regulates the amount of iron in your body, and it does so by controlling the absorption of iron through your gut. And what we've learned is that if you have a big tablet full of iron, then a bit of iron gets into the body, and then what it does is it switches on extra levels of hepcidin to be made by the body as part of this normal response of the body to try and prevent getting too much iron in, because too much iron is also toxic. But that means when that person who is still iron deficient try and takes more iron tablets, that iron is just not getting in. Hepcidin blocks it. That's hepcidin's job. Hepcidin's job is actually to inhibit the absorption of iron from the diet. And so you run into this thing called the hepcidin block, and it lasts for a good day or so. And during that time, the body can't really absorb any iron from the diet, whether it's in a tablet or whether it's in food or whatever. So what we're learning is that it might be better, it seems to be better, to have an iron tablet in the morning and then actually wait a couple of days until you have the next one. And we're still experimenting on that and figuring out if this really is the best thing to do. But it fits the way that the body actually is trying to respond to iron. And we need to learn more about that, how the body deals with this naturally in order to treat iron deficiency more sensibly.
Now, is that with tolerance? Is that why you want to give it that gap period so people can adjust to like their body? I mean, if you're taking a supplement every single day, the same exact supplement, your body's going to eventually get used to it. I mean, first of all, if you're making a supplement that's an iron supplement and you're trying to get the proper nutrients or the proper requirements, I would say like make it like 2 pills or like maybe dumb down the percentage. Like just because people tend to be like, oh, take one. They take like six. They don't just take one, they take like six. So that's what I would put in. But when it comes to their tolerance levels, I'm guessing that's what that break in that time period is for.
Yeah. So tolerance is a good word for it. That's a fine word for it, but we would put a molecular explanation onto that. And it's not so much tolerance in the way that it works. The mechanism is that it's the first bit of iron goes in, and then the body makes a natural response to stop more iron getting in because it knows that having too much iron is a risk. The body's learned that over evolutionary periods of time, that too much iron is a risk factor for infections and for damage of your body. So it actually is trying quite hard to keep iron out, which makes iron deficiency quite a tough thing to treat.
Have you done tests or experiments on trying to figure out like when should be like if you're going to take a pill on a Monday, should you take it on a Wednesday or a Friday? I mean, I would just think from like blood extraction, you could tell if the iron levels have dipped down at all.
So those are exactly the experiments that are ongoing. They're being led by some collaborators, friends of ours from Switzerland, although other people are doing them too. And one of the things that our lab does is to really kind of understand the basic biology, the mechanisms, and the molecules underneath that. So if you like, we're the kind of the guys who are figuring out the nuts and bolts of it, and then other people take that and apply that to real humans in real settings. So it's a kind of a team effort.
How do you create a iron supplement or a way to get people their proper iron without having a pathogen also get beneficial qualities from that iron?
Well, that is probably the single most important question in the field because I mean it's hard to over exaggerate the importance of iron for different pathogens. It's an absolutely critical nutrient for many infectious organisms, particularly bacteria, although also the malaria parasite loves iron too. And it's quite often the rate limiting step in an infection as to whether a parasite or a bacteria will really grow or not. Can it get hold of iron or not? There are some extraordinary stories about this. I'll tell you two if you don't mind.
Okay.
So one is a very famous study on an island called the Pemba Island off the coast of Tanzania, where 24,000 children were recruited into a very large clinical trial with the idea that giving iron and other nutrients would really help them, would help them grow, they wouldn't become anemic, and they'd be healthier. And the trial had to be stopped after 11 months because of a statistically significant increase in the number of children being hospitalized and even dying in the arms of the trial, in the trial where all of those children were receiving their nutrients. And it was infections that were being promoted, probably particularly malaria, but it's not quite clear which infections there were. And, this was really, as you can imagine, caused a great deal of angst and issues in about 15 years ago when this data came out. And what it was finally really showing was that if you change the iron balance in children where there's a very high infectious burden in that population on this island off the coast of Africa, lots of malaria, lots of other bugs around, and relatively poor access to healthcare, then iron can be a real risk. It really can be a risk. And so getting iron safely to populations where there's a lot of infectious risk is probably the key issue. And it is not something that we've solved at all. And it's an ongoing major problem because the alternative, is okay, let's just not do it. But then you're essentially leaving vast numbers of people around the world in a state where they're anemic and iron deficient, and that's suboptimal too. So it's a really tricky problem. And then
Oh,
go on.
yeah. I was about to say, like, how would you like, are you looking at methods of like how other places have dealt with their iron deficiency or getting their iron supplementation in without the use of medications? Like I mentioned, the Haitian mud cookies. I mean, it's an old method, but I mean, that's pretty effective considering that there hasn't been I mean, there is issues that are going on over there, but I'm saying it's a good start of like coming into a great aspect of it.
Well, I must make an admission that I'm not overly familiar with the Haitian mud cookies. I'll have to look into that. That sounds very
It's like a
interesting.
dirt it's literally just dirt, but they shape it to look like a snickerdoodle. And apparently from what I've heard of it, they put a lot of butter on it or they put a lot of salt or something on it, but apparently it's just packing your stomach to keep you away from starvation. But the essential nutrients that you get from it, I mean, they talk about it over there. Pregnant women eat it all the time just for help with baby and stuff. But you can't eat too much of it because you can also clog up your stomach.
Yeah, sounds, yeah, okay. Well, I think one of the major issues at the moment in the global health field is to try and find a way of delivering iron safely and effectively to populations that really need it. And it is just a tough question because it's a nutrient that is required by so many bacteria and so many parasites, but also by growing humans. So there are lots of different ways in which people are trying to do it. New types of formulations of iron, which are based more on the types of iron that we have in our body anyway, where iron is bound to heme or is bound to other proteins, and so it might be able to be taken up in a more natural way rather than giving it in a tablet as a sort of a salt form, an iron inorganic salt. Um, there are other treatments which are more medicalized, but potentially actually safer, which are intravenous injections of iron. And there's a formulation of iron which appears to be very safe. And of course, if you're injecting it, that you're bypassing that block in the gut. So this is, and you can give it a lot of iron in one shot. And this is used clinically in the States and in the UK for people with iron deficiency or people with various disorders related to iron deficiency, where you need to get a lot of iron into them quickly. But it's possible that it could also be useful in global health settings as well, where particularly for pregnant women, where it's difficult, much harder for children, but for pregnant women, it's definitely possible to deliver those sorts of shots safely and effectively. And somebody who's a very long-standing friend of mine based in Australia is doing exactly this trial in Africa at the moment. And it's very exciting because it has a chance of making a real difference. But it is, as you say, kind of quite, relatively medicalized. Diet's tough though too, because populations are used to having a particular diet, and it's pretty hard to get people to change diet, and particularly if it's informed by very powerful, strong religious and cultural traditions. It's hard to say, okay, now you need to eat something else. That's just not really an easy thing to do. So, it's a tricky problem, no doubt about it. It's why a lot of time has been spent on it. And we have not, as a field, made a lot of progress, it must be said, in the last 10, 15 years. But we're keeping on trying.
Well, that's the fun thing is that a lot of people probably don't like know about this at all, and then this is new to them. And then also, if you're saying like we don't have a lot of information on, it, I mean that's what makes it fun and kind of new. I mean, this is an area that we got to explore as well too. I got a question, but I'll get to it in a second. I want to talk about is the reason why we can't make a synthetic or a type of iron supplement so close to the animal version, like the red meat version, is it FDA? Reasons? Is it something? Because I have to feel like if you're a vegan and you can't eat red meat, whatever that specific thing is you're getting in red meat, there's a quality that's close to the way that our brain or our mind has been able to perceive the same, I guess, the resiliency in the iron that we can absorb as well too. That's why it must closely relate to us in some sense. Not like genetic wise, but just that we're used to it. We're used to having this, so the brain's like, oh, I know what to do with this. But I'm guessing it's probably like FDA standards. How do you create that same synthetic thing, that same chemical that is specifically to that iron meat?
Yeah, but is not derived from animals.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So I guess you'd be familiar with Impossible Foods.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they are one of a few different people who've done a really great job of essentially making heme iron, or a form of iron that's really like heme and actually does taste like heme, right? But is not from animals. And so that does have approval. And the idea is that potentially this could be, that concept in general could be a way of getting a much more absorbable type of iron into, not just guys in California, but people in sub-Saharan Africa and in Bangladesh and so on, that where it's really, really needed, for hundreds of millions of children who are otherwise very iron deficient and who don't get access to meat often, or may not be able to want it even if they did. So I think you're exactly right. It's new formulations, and a kind of a vegetable type heme is one way of doing it. There may be ways of using other proteins that can contain iron that we normally have, which can be synthesized in a way that does not involve animals. That there are other possibilities in that general conceptual area. That's right.
So I want to ask, what's the worst possible scenario that you're more concerned with, of like the direction we go with iron supplementation? Do you think that it would just get to a point where people would not probably try and go for like an injection shot or anything like that, but they would just rather a company be able to put that into their food for them? Like, I think that's where, like, if you start talking about like iron supplementation and ways that we can get iron, people, I mean, I'll go down the conspiracy rabbit hole. They do it with milk. They raise up certain calcium and things in milk when they pasteurize it. So I go, I mean, I don't want it to be up to like a fast food company to start, giving you your iron because all you're doing is eating burgers because you have 3 jobs or something like that.
Well, I don't know. Do you have cereal for breakfast, or do you
Every single day, dude? I have 13 boxes in my pantry. That's the one thing I can't stop eating.
That's a lot of boxes.
I eat a box every 2 days.
Well, you're probably getting a fair bit of iron from that, because extra iron is put into almost all cereals. You should check. A lot of them have extra added iron in already, and it's the same for flour as well. You can get extra iron in flour. So bread usually has more iron in than it would normally have, and it's deliberately added. And this is all to combat iron deficiency in children in Western countries. It's been going on for decades.
So that's what they mean by steel gut.
Yeah, maybe.
That was a bad joke.
You're getting rusty.
Yeah, but I mean, that makes sense. Yeah, because you want to give kids, and how many kids just want to eat candy? I don't think candy has a lot of iron in it, so it's a great way to supplement into their cereal. But it's a little bit different. I think a lot of people probably don't know that, but with adults, like if you're saying we're going to supplement your food, there's a big kind of tear between people, especially when you get older.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
no, got it. Understood completely. So you read what's on the box, man.
The people don't read, man. As soon as they see a news article that says they're supplementing your food with iron, they immediately want to jump to getting rid of whatever that food is.
Dear. Well, iron is an incredibly important, very good thing, and it's relatively hard to have too much of it through the diet, because your body is really quite good at keeping it out, and you'd have to have, I don't know, 13,000 boxes of cereal in your pantry before you were at risk of iron overdose from your bran flakes or something. So that I don't really see that as so much of an issue. Iron overload disorders are caused not so much by diet. It's pretty rare. They're normally caused by genetics. So when that system that I was telling you about, where we have this hormone hepcidin or hepcidin that's switched on after you have iron in your diet and then keeps further iron out, there are very common mutations that basically prevent that system from working as well as it should. And those individuals are predisposed. They don't always get it. Depends also on a bit of diet and all sorts of other factors. But they can get iron overload disorder, and that's a fairly common disease called hemochromatosis. Hereditary hemochromatosis means that it's to do with iron and blood and color, and it's one of the most common single gene genetic disorders in Caucasians. It's not very common in other populations, but in other populations, so for example, in Africa and in South Asia, a very common disease is something called thalassemia, which is related a little bit to sickle cell disease, in which it's a mutation in genes which control making red blood cells, and it protects against malaria, like sickle cell does, but thalassemia also leads to really bad iron overload. So there are these two genetic diseases, hemochromatosis and thalassemia, which are really the causes of pathological iron overload. Rarely is it because you've eaten too many burgers. Fairly rarely. That wasn't help, right? But you really need some genetics underneath it too.
Is there, when we go back to creating a synthetic version that wouldn't be beneficial to like parasites or pathogens, but you could actually have something that's more beneficial to human, is there a way to maybe just tweak the quality if there is like a possible solution to where it's not going to affect pathogens, but it's going to be something new that our body could get used to in a sense?
I think that's going to be very hard because bacteria and parasites are very highly evolved to basically capture iron from us. So, the form of iron that we get given in the diet, it will get into us and then it will be incorporated into our normal iron proteins, the enzymes that need iron to make DNA, to make energy, to carry oxygen, all that stuff. The iron's going to end up in the same place, right? No matter how you give it in the first place. And there'll just be more of it. And bacteria are very, very, very good at scavenging iron from us. They're pirates. They're extremely good at stealing our iron. They thrive on it. So I think that's going to be tricky to make a form of iron that is essentially, stealth iron and can't be robbed by your bugs.
So the question I want to get to is going to be two-parter. One, without the data that you've seen or the data that we've collected, because I feel like some of that data is probably skewed more towards the physical aspects of iron deficiency. But do you have a concern about the mental aspects, like the psychological aspects of iron deficiency? If we talk about cognitive ability slowing down, I mean that's a big thing right now, just with the concept of brain fog after what they would call long COVID. So I'm generally curious if there's going to see a giant pull in that direction because I start wondering about neurodegenerative diseases where people's brains are like slowly kind of tearing down, and I feel like that's probably something like iron as well too. That not supplementing enough, your brain starts to lose certain parts of oxygen. You get fatigue, your body wants to go to sleep, or just passing out. I mean, I have no clue. There's probably not an extreme case like that, but
Well, so in children, in growing children, again, in relatively poor parts of the world, iron deficiency is fairly well associated with impairment of cognitive development. But that's because in growing children, brain growth is very highly iron intensive, needs a lot of iron, needs a lot of metabolism, a heck of a lot of energy, and iron helps you make the energy. So that's fairly well described. But in adults, which is maybe what you're kind of getting into a bit more, is iron deficiency associated with poor cognitive performance and brain fog and so on? I think that's less well explored. Um, in terms of long COVID, it again not very well explored at all. Although a lot of data is coming that in many diseases, infectious diseases, which have this chronic aspect to them, where people have inflammation for a very long time. Very often, part of that is iron is distributed differently in the body. So the iron atoms actually go to different types of cells compared to how they would normally be distributed. So there might be in the one sort of white blood cell, but not another. They might not be able to get into the liver as well, and so on and so forth. And we don't really understand what the consequences of that is, but it's almost certain that there are some, because in every single cell that you have, iron is doing something important. So if you start putting the iron in different locations in the body, you might well have some processes, some organs working less well than others. That's kind of pretty speculative and pretty hypothetical, but I think it's also plausible. In terms of neurodegenerative disorders, there are in fact some that are directly related to iron, but iron overload. So there's things called NBIA, and these are definitely associated with too much iron being found in the brain. And if you have too much iron, what it does, the reason why it's a bad thing, aside from the issue of infection, is that iron is an extremely reactive chemical element, and it generates things called free radicals catalytically. So it keeps on making them. You get lots and lots of free radicals per atom of iron if you have too much iron, if it's not doing its job properly. And so that can lead to tissue damage. And so where you have that extra iron, the local surrounding tissues will get damaged. And so there are some disorders some neurodegenerative disorders associated with too much iron in the brain. And it also, in hemochromatosis that I was mentioning earlier, it's the liver that tends to be affected. Too much iron in the liver, and you get liver damage from that. So too much iron is toxic. because of its chemical reactivity, but it's also bad because bugs can use it to grow. So there's two reasons why too much iron is bad.
When it comes to iron being at a severe level, maybe on E for a very long time, does the body try and find the same exact what's similar to that nutrient somewhere else and try and pull it from somewhere else?
Uh, there's nothing. Iron is essentially irreplaceable in many of the processes that we have. So it's been like that, for literally billions of years. So the very ancient forms of life adapted iron to help them make DNA and to help them make energy and so on. And iron's become, just fundamentally ingrained in metabolism of almost all living organisms. And you can't replace it with any other element for most of those things. There's two quite remarkable exceptions to this, and I think you'll find these interesting. So the first one is an organism called Lactobacilli, and these are friendly bacteria that live in your gut, and they've managed to evolve to not need iron essentially at all. And they use manganese instead of iron in their metabolism, in their enzymes, and so on. And so one of the reasons why that's important is if you have too much iron and you have too many iron tablets and so on, the lactobacilli can't grow on that. And it's the unfriendly bacteria that do need iron that can outgrow the protective lactobacilli. So that's one of the reasons why that goes wrong. The second organism that we know of that doesn't need iron is actually the causative factor of Lyme disease, is Borrelia burgdorferi. The bug that causes Lyme disease. And again, in some extraordinary feat of evolution, it's managed to basically avoid using iron, and again, tends to use manganese as well. So apart from those two, every single form of life is utterly dependent on iron because it has unique biochemical properties. It's able to catalyze lots of reactions, and it's able to bind lots of other atoms in different orientations. And it's just a really, really cool atom element from a kind of a biological perspective.
Well, if you probably took a poll, most things would probably be made with a little bit of iron inside of it. Um, but when it comes to temperature regulation, what what do you, because for me, if you put a thermostat up to me and you put it on my chest is going to be like probably a 96, but my hands are 74. I've tested this at work. My hands always go like blue, or they go like they're the first things to get cold even when it's not really cold out, and I'm guessing that's from my iron deficiency. That's how I know so much of, at least a good amount, about iron for like a common public person, because I did my own research into it to try and figure out ways to supplement and ways to this. I have ADHD. I think that might be a cause factor of why I burn so much iron. It's the reason, like hypertension as well too. I like all these things where I'm like, I do that twice as much as that person. How are they not doing that? You can say it's a genetic thing for sure. I think the genetic cause for me would be the ADHD, is my body's like a furnace and it's burning twice as much as it's supposed to.
Well, they say cold hands, warm heart, right? So, but no, so I mean, I wouldn't be able to diagnose, right? I mean, maybe there's some circulation things as well. Uh, iron, iron, its role in thermoregulation. I'm not familiar. I don't know. There's a strongly well described role for that, but there's certainly clearly a deep underlying role of iron in burning energy and making energy. So your ATP that your body uses as a form of energy, a molecule called ATP. The synthesis of ATP requires iron and oxygen. And it's a very key basic metabolic process, millions and millions and millions of years old, and very, very highly iron requiring.
The reason why I asked about if a low deficiency could cause an organ to try and find a chemical that's similar, or find a piece that's similar, or supplement that's similar, to be able to pull from, is because of the thermogenic response. That like my hands getting cold keeps the blood flowing towards more of my organs to preserve those, because those are more important than like my fingertips and toes. Usually it's the farthest appendages that tend to get cold first because it's farther away from the heart. It takes more energy to pump that blood there. So I was just wondering, because I think our bodies are incredibly fascinating, and I think, in my opinion, they have minds of their own, and they kind of are able to notice things that you aren't able to notice. I mean, the fact that we're able to just breathe and expect it to work every single day is a fascinating concept of it. But stresses the importance of making sure that you also get every single essential vitamin and also every single essential nutrient that you can possibly get. But you got to understand that there has to be an area of leniency for the aspect that some places don't have the measures or precautions to be able to receive those supplements, which makes it even more important to try and make sure we can find a way to give those places supplementation. But the biggest one, which usually probably gets the most amount of funding, would be infectious diseases, because that's a prime importance of just something that everyone can randomly get, and we don't know when it's going to happen. But I wonder how long until a person notices that they might be iron deficient without going to a doctor. Like, is there signs, and then how long can they run on E without experiencing like a severe side effect? Like, I know we talk about like our brains, for instance. If our brain's missing a certain chemical or missing, or maybe a certain amount of sleep, you start getting tired more. But then eventually, like, what causes irreversible damage in a sense? Imagine you're not getting a nutrient for long enough, and the next thing you know, when you do bounce back from E, you don't come back 100%.
Okay, I'm not so familiar with effects of E, but what I'll say. So I think a couple of things you said there, I need to make a response to. So
Well, the E was a gas tank. I meant like empty.
oh right, okay,
Yeah,
good.
it's not an actual supplement.
No, good. I was worried it was ecstasy or something, but no. Great. Anyway, so what I would say is that, although my lab is iron obsessed, that's what we work on. You're absolutely right. You need a balance of lots of nutrients, right? Iron alone is not going to do the job. How long would it take for somebody who is iron deficient to realize that they're iron deficient is a really important question, and it's tough to answer because it depends a lot on the age of the person, how active they are, what they're trying to do. Athletes, when they get iron deficient, probably notice it pretty quickly. Certainly, you will notice effects of iron deficiency before you become anemic. That's definitely for sure. I've just got a helicopter coming into the hospital. I'm afraid it might interfere with the sound slightly, but you can't do much about it. And then in terms of irreversible damage, that's a great question, and it does appear that beyond a certain point, particularly in infants, if there's severe iron deficiency, you can get irreversible damage. I think to the pituitary is the particular part of the brain that can be affected. That's quite old data, but seems to be pretty secure. So it can happen. Certainly, most effects of iron deficiency are usually reversible. If the right kind of iron levels can be restored, then mostly it's reversible. But that is an example of something that appears not to be.
Now, with the increase of iron supplementation in the general population, would you see that these microbes or these, and I would say diseases or these pathogens also find a way to adapt as well too? I also talk about our sanitation as probably a reason why a lot of people get sick easier, just because we're not like living out in the middle of the forest eating raw meat or something like that. Usually, like, if you notice during the pandemic, there was a thing in the States called a red meat scare. And the red meat scare was that every single news broadcasting stations, just like toilet paper, said that red meat was going to be, you're not going to find it. And everyone flocked to the stores and doubled up on red meat. Well, the interesting thing about that was the number of people, like, because you're in a lockdown, you're eating red meat. The E. coli numbers went up by 5%. And you get this aspect of like, is that just because people were eating something, getting way too much iron maybe into their blood and causing their bodies to become weaker, or their immune systems to become kind of, very vulnerable to other bacteria that also need this form of iron?
It could be. I haven't read. I mean, it's more or less plausible. What we tend to find, though, is that in populations that normally have extremely good access to first-line healthcare, to antibiotics, and are just generally relatively hygienic, that iron supplementation is not really at all dangerous in terms of causing those systemic, really nasty infections. Sure, you can get effects of having too many iron tablets on your gut, and it's unpleasant, and also it doesn't really work. But in terms of really promoting a bloodstream sepsis, that is really quite rare, because your immune system works, and you've also got the population as a whole has got access to antibiotics, and so it's usually kind of pretty okay. But it's absolutely the concern again in poorer populations in the world, and where access to frontline healthcare is worse, but also the general burden of infection is much higher, in part because of hygiene issues, but also because of environmental factors. And that, if you're in the jungle, there's just tends to be more bugs than there is if you're in downtown Manhattan. But it is always worth bearing in mind, and you're absolutely right to say that bugs have the ability to adapt and to get better at scavenging iron. That's been very well described, in lots of different experiments and lots of different observations, genetic changes in bugs in order to get better at capturing iron from their host as they kind of move between hosts. That definitely does happen.
When it comes to with iron supplementation, again, because I'm really kind of trying to figure out ways of like how can we incorporate this more into areas that would be neglecting. Is there a more of a focus of trying to make sure that people aren't getting infected, or making sure that people actually grow up sustainable lives, I would say, or maybe full growth development? Because I mean, we all know some people, like there's a kid at my work who's 24 as well, same age as me, but he has like muscular dystrophy in a sense. And he talks about like a lot of times when he was a kid, he wasn't getting the proper nutrients. And I'm like, well, is it also a genetic factor? No, his family says it's not a genetic factor, but not getting the proper nutrients. I mean, there's a prime example. Like I picture myself, for instance, would I look like how I look like now if I didn't find the gym? Probably not. But would I look like how I do right now if I just completely neglected my health when it came to beneficial nutrients that just from getting from prior food? If I just drank water and went down this different rabbit hole, would my whole entire genetic makeup look completely different?
Yeah, your genetic makeup wouldn't look any different, but you might look different.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Um, yeah. So I think that's a tricky one as well, but it
It's a good
depends very
question.
much on it depends very much on the population, right? If we're talking about UK, US, Europe, and so on, then the risk of infection is relatively low, and infectious diseases generally, apart from the occasional pandemic, very well controlled. There's not, we don't have malaria being rife, we don't have TB being rife. Those sorts of things are relatively controlled. As you compare that, so from that respect, getting the right nutrients to make sure that there's good growth and health is the reason, right? Is the driving factor. But in areas again where there's a high infectious burden, when there's all sorts of bugs ready to go, then you've got to be a lot more careful. And that's where the problem really is. So iron deficiency, we should say, is relatively protective against some infections. So particularly, it's well known that it's protective against malaria. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we know that this is important, and it's important in children, and it's important in pregnant women. So if you try and make the iron deficiency better, you do, in fact, run the risk of exacerbating malaria. So where do you draw the line there? How do you make that decision? Because iron deficiency isn't very good, particularly if there's anemia, and particularly if it's a pregnant woman we're talking about, or a growing child. But malaria can be pretty bad too. So figuring out that balance is just extremely difficult problem.
Well, it led to the question I was going to ask, which is I bet if you took a poll about the number of people that, like from the States or the UK, that travel to another country, their infection rates, what's the percentage back on infection rates? I have to feel like maybe part of the reason that if there's iron deficiency, if you're going to look for like maybe a somewhat positive light, is the fact that they're maybe not infected. I know people talk about like maybe it's just the area, you're not used to that type of thing. That's why people usually take malaria medication or something, because we don't have that over here. But I go also, we're getting a abundance of nutrients that another place is not getting. So we're also going to be like the prime target in a sense. And that's why you see a lot of people that suffer from those infectious diseases or
Well,
pathogens.
that's true, but it's also because if you grow up in a place surrounded by bugs, then you naturally develop immunity to them. You should, if you're healthy enough. Whereas if I went out to I don't know, Papua New Guinea and got some infectious disease that I would never have seen, then it's quite possible it would do far more damage to me than it would to a native of that area, because I'd never had the chance to develop an immune response ever. And so I potentially, would be overwhelmed by a pathogen that a person who's been living in that environment for a long time would have developed some immunity to. So it's that naivety that different populations have to different bugs that's an issue. And added on to that is then, yes, of course, would I be a good host? Well, I probably would, because I've got a reasonable diet, and I'm probably full of the amount of iron and other nutrients that bugs will need. So yeah, those are the sort of the factors to bear in mind.
When it comes to the human species, is this like this in pets as well too? Do they need a certain amount of iron in their thing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very much so. So puppies and kittens can get a lot of iron deficiency if they're growing rapidly. Pigs are, because of the many decades, centuries of breeding pigs to maximize litter size and to maximize growth of pigs, piglets naturally become very iron deficient and anemic. So almost all piglets get either injection of iron or iron added to their mum's milk, the sow's milk, in order to get them through this period of extremely rapid growth. So yeah, piglets are normally very iron deficient indeed. But it actually can work the other way. So one of the famous examples is rhinoceroses. Some species of rhinoceros that in the wild live on an absolutely horrific diet, just twigs and bits of grass and stuff, and are extremely good at getting the iron out of that. And so they're a bit iron deficient usually, but they're a rhino. They've managed to grow so big. Then you put a rhino in a zoo and you give it what you think is really healthy, nutritious food, but it can get a kind of an iron overload disorder because it doesn't have that ability that humans have of making hepcidin to block out the extra iron. Rhinos, if they've been living in a very iron deficient diet for however many hundreds of thousands of years, have lost that ability. At least some species have. So when you get them in a zoo situation and you give them what you think is good food, but has lots of iron in it, it actually can be toxic. So there are quite a few zoo-related issues of animals in zoos where the iron in the diet can have toxicity issues, and it's quite a well-recognized problem. And it's all to do with whether that animal's normal diet that it's evolved to is very low iron or not. So if you can imagine, a good example is bats too. So if you think of vampire bat, what does a vampire bat live on? It lives on blood. So it's extremely good at dealing with iron. And so vampire bats don't really get ill in zoos when you give them really good food or blood. But a fruit bat is evolved to live on fruit, and there's not much iron in fruit. And if you give it a kind of a high iron diet, then it can't really defend itself from it very well. And so there can be toxicities. So, bats, but fruit bat versus vampire bat, very different diets leads to very different biological adaptation.
Back to the cognitive issues, is it possible that there could be like would you say like the general public, like their health in the iron department is good? Would you say that it's bad? Would you say like has it been declining over a period of time or has it been increasing?
I'd say I wouldn't, I don't see much evidence for a decline. I don't know how much data there really is out there.
Because I'm trying to find the correlation with cognitive function, depression, and all that.
Yeah. I mean, I think these are very, very multifactorial, and diet and iron could potentially play a role, but it's unlikely to, in my view, unlikely to be a major cause. I think it's very, very complex. I do think that it's very possible that iron deficiency is relatively undiagnosed. So I think there may be more people with iron deficiency around than we realize. And I also think that the effects of iron deficiency on our bodies are not as, we really don't understand it as much as we should.
Would it ever get to a point where instead of taking a pill, you could find another way to be able to get it not just from food, but like maybe a spray, like a nose spray or something like that? That
No,
would just,
no spray of iron. That's an interesting
I
idea.
know it's dumb now that you say it out
Yeah,
loud,
no,
but
I don't know. No, it's not dumb at all. That's, why not? Think about it. It depends on how it's absorbed. Where we know the iron is absorbed is in a particular area of your intestinal tract called the duodenum, just downstream of the stomach. And so I think really the iron's basically got to get to there, or you give it via a needle, intravenously. So I think, giving it in the nose, it might not get in. It might just you might just get a sore nose. I don't know.
yeah. 'Cause like I said, there's going to be people out there that aren't going to like taking a pill. I don't like taking pills at all, even supplements and vitamins. I try and get it from natural food or something like that.
So the other thing that people do is they have is fortificants, is powders, that you kind of sprinkle on food, and they contain lots of different nutrients, but they don't alter the taste of the food, and they just basically go in the food. That's powders and sprinkles. But the other thing is then fortificants, which then go into the food, like flour or into your bran flakes. So not tablets. So tablets is one way of doing it. Fortificants going into the basic raw material foodstuff is another, and then sprinkles, putting them on top of the food once it's cooked, is a third one. So you're not restricted to tablets.
Huh. Well, I gotta ask, how'd you get interested in just studying iron?
Huh. Uh, yeah. So,
I just don't picture you waking up at like, I'm gonna study iron today.
well, that's what I do, you know. That's the nature of my existence. But I think it's what happened was I'm trained as an immunologist, and there's a whole bunch of genes that control the immune system that my first boss was working on, and a new one was discovered, and it looked exactly like it should be controlling the immune system. It just looked like one of those genes, but it turned out instead that when this gene goes wrong, people end up with this disorder called hemochromatosis that I mentioned to you before. So the question was, what is this gene that looks like an immunological gene doing, actually controlling iron? What are the deep relationships between iron and the immune system and infection? There really are some, and that's what we've been working on. I think that, for really a very long time now. We found that if you don't have enough iron, then your immune response just does not work as well. And I think that's potentially a really important finding that we're following up in all sorts of basic studies in the lab, but also clinical trials where we're asking if we give iron in people at the time that they're getting their vaccines, does it actually make their immune response to the vaccine better? Because it means your white blood cells can get the iron that they need when they need it, when they're getting the vaccine. So I think these are quite important questions.
What is the most common thing that people get infected with if they have too little iron and then too much iron?
Yeah. So too much iron, that's a relatively easy one, I think. So there's a bug called Vibrio vulnificans that lives in oysters, and normally it doesn't cause. If you get an infection with Vibrio, it would not cause a problem to somebody who is either iron deficient or just has normal amounts of iron. But if you have hemochromatosis, it's 50% mortality in a few days. So it can be really dangerous. So it absolutely loves iron, and then it grows out of control very quickly. So that's the riskiest one to get. Malaria, though, is probably arguably the most important worldwide in terms of its mortality and its sensitivity to iron. What infections would you get most likely if you're iron deficient? That's a harder one. I don't think we really know the answer to that, but it will be some bacteria, potentially bacteria that don't live in the bloodstream but live within other types of cells. But I think that's a really tough one. The other thing is viruses. So the ability of the body to clear viral infections really needs a very good immune response that needs iron. So it may be that viral infections are particularly may be common in people who are iron deficiency. People who have iron deficiency, but the data is not really out there on it. I have to say, it's not really out there.
What do you think about like with types of medicines, antibiotics, that the type of resistance that's building up where these antibiotics might not be as useful as they were before? You think iron might play a factor into maybe helping find another route to a medical treatment?
Yeah, definitely. The people are definitely. It's a great question. People are definitely working on that. How. So this wouldn't actually kill a bug, so it wouldn't be microbicidal, but it would be bacteriostatic. So it would stop them growing. So if you could deny iron to bacteria, then it can't grow. It wouldn't necessarily die, but if it's not growing, it's not going to cause you a problem. And then you gain more time for your body to then fight off an infection if the bugs aren't growing. And in fact, that is what the body does anyway. So one part of the immune response to basically almost all infections is actually to actively take iron away from the bugs. And this is something called nutritional immunity, it's called, but that molecule that I keep banging on about, hepcidin, is really part of that. So if you have an infection, hepcidin goes right up, and that means you have much less iron in your bloodstream, and that is very protective against a whole series of important infections. And so, part of defending yourself against infection anyway is to try and take iron away from the invading microorganism. But if we can get better at it, if we can improve that process, then yeah, it's a good route. It's a good theoretical route forward.
How much does iron actually play into the immune system? Like if I have iron deficiency, but I rarely get sick.
Yeah, depends, right? I think it depends on how exposed you are to different types of infections, and whether your immune system is able to deal with it, and maybe how iron deficient you are. Because iron deficiency, although it can be diagnosed by whether you have hemoglobin below a certain level, or whether you have other blood tests that go below a certain level. Of course, it's actually a continuum. And so some people can be a lot more iron deficient than others. And we expect that that the more iron deficient that a person is, then the more likely their immune system is to be affected by that. And then on top of that, that person then obviously has to be exposed to the infectious bacteria or whatever in the first place. If they're not exposed, then you'll never know.
Do you think, because back to what you said before about like taking a pill and then spreading it out over a couple of days, do you think with a better like kind of method, one that like has enough studies behind it to show that it's proven to work, do you think with that better education and like maybe like how people learn about like nutritional plans, that you would see an overall beneficial quality of overall life?
Yeah, I really do. I think that if we can optimize giving iron in a way that's safe and effective, it will benefit enormous numbers of people, because it's such a key nutrient for so many different populations, not just 24-year-old guys, but infants, pregnant women, the elderly. It's really a really critical nutrient, there's no doubt about that, but we're not very good at getting it into people in a very safe and efficacious way.
Is there iron in baby formula?
Yeah, there can be. Yeah, it depends. Almost always there is. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just wondering if it's like an excessive amount depending on how much they need.
No, I don't think so. It's been, it's pretty well mapped out. And there's not much iron. There's some iron in natural mother's milk, and I think there's a little bit more in formula, but it depends a lot on the different type and so on. But it's very heavily regulated, as you can imagine.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you for giving me your time and doing the podcast. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm on Twitter, so that's at Drakesmith
I'm following you.
underscore lab. Are you? Thank you. I'm honored. And then, yeah, if you just, my surname is relatively unusual. So if you just type in Drakesmith and iron, then you'll get to me pretty quickly.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure I link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.